of material to get through in about half an hour. So this is actually the debriefing from a very large GTM configuration and migration from GA Classic to Universal, and the learnings from that process. The reason why it says 1 billion hits per month for this site was that at the time Google kind of charges based off hits. So if you're on GA Premium, like tier 1 might be sort of 1 million hits, and then tier 2 might be 1 billion. So if you go over like a second tier, you'll charge more. Those tiers are broken out a little bit more now, but the premise of this was it was basically a very large site and a lot of kind of moving parts. Kind of whiz through me. Really quick kind of survey or question for the people that are in the audience. How many implementations of GTM have you done? So, for instance, if you put your hand up, if you've done like 1 to 2 implementations, okay, or 3 to 4, okay, or more than 4. Okay, so we've actually got a quite experienced group here. That's great. So this stuff should kind of resonate with you. These are lots of large implementations that I've done. This particular one was a massive implementation, and it's the story of that implementation. Oops, next one. So it's a very large, as I said, oh, I don't think is that right? A very large, can you hear me okay? Yeah. So it's a very large site or a new client that is a behemoth of a client. So when I was kind of handed this project, it was 400 man-hours of GTM project, 600 GA Classic events, GA Classic to Universal page view migration, in-house TMS file moving over to GTM, and kind of to add sort of fuel to the flames, there was 6 CMS platforms that needed to be dealt with, and only 3 months to complete. Holy sheesh. That is like, whoa. And it gets worse, there was a fine if it wasn't done in time. Holy yeah, and that's not untrue. To give you an idea of the scale of this particular project, of behemothclient.com, they had more than 6 CMS that were in place and lots of kind of legacy systems and processes. It's a scenario where GTM is actually a very good solution because it does standardize, but obviously the CMSs themselves are not standardized. And built with is a really good way of quickly kind of gauging the water as to how complex the site is, or sites within a top level domain. Another quick way of gauging the size of a site is to do site colon search. So here we have a competitor for LexLuthor.com who has 35,000 results in terms of indexed pages, and this one, Behemoth Client, was on at least double that, and in fact probably more than 1 million results. So it was a big site. So the process for this one, now when I normally take on these sort of projects, I try and enforce a GTM audit to kind of get a sort of line in the sand. This particular one, the client didn't want to pay for an audit, so it kind of got sort of sidestepped a little bit. And also, there are a lot of things that were not obvious, sort of within the outside of the GTM container. For instance, like the use of this sort of other TMS file and the ways that other TMS file were sort of deployed. So one of the lessons was if you get a migration from an existing TMS, and this was an in-house TMS, it wasn't like a Tilium or a sort of Insighton, it was a bespoke TMS. So watch out for those ones. And obviously it was not just migrating the page view tag, it was also 200 other events that needed to be switched from GA Classic to Universal within GTM itself, in addition to 400 other inline events that also needed to be moved from GA Classic to GTM. And in addition to that, this in-house TMS file needed to be replaced entirely and then moved over to GTM. And the TMS file had lots of things like scroll tracking and some custom sort of configs within there. So it was a bit of a kind of massive mountain to climb. The one thing, and in addition to migrating from GA Classic to Universal, so the good news is actually from this project, it was achieved within the 3-month period. The kind of you'd think it's almost impossible, but lots of kind of late nights, we actually got it there. Regarding that point about the fine, and you're probably thinking, 3-month deadline to get all this done, it's going to be a bit of a problem and, not good. The reality was, as you might have seen from the Superman kind of Batman movie, they're never going to kill off Superman. He always comes back to life, the dust above his tomb starts moving. The same kind of happened in this scenario. The reality was that the client was so slow to get some of the things done, there was always in-house dependencies that stopped, that prevented an external consultant or external agency from being accused of causing a delay. So the financial penalties, although in theory they were very problematic, in practical existence they didn't cause a problem. The main reason is because their IT department is just insanely slow to get stuff done. So there was always a kind of get out of jail free card. And it was impossible to enforce that fine. So, as I said, this project was done in 3 months. So how did I go about defeating the monster and slaying the beast? What went right and what went wrong? And what can you learn from this? Another kind of quick survey. When I approach this, I'm kind of more on the sort of technical side, as in implementation side and GTM configuration. I'm kind of curious to know where people fall within the room. I know we've got a lot of experienced GTM and Google Analytics people here. Are you kind of on the technical side, or are you on the analytical side, as in reporting side, or are you on the business side, as in kind of account management? So I've kind of split these into into these 3 categories. To kind of keep it simple, as I said, I was more on the technical side, as in doing the GTM configuration. So in this scenario, I'm Batman. Sorry. And then the agency was doing the tactical stuff, and the account manager, as in their Superman in this example. And don't worry, they pretend to die, but they come back to life, and etc. And so, out of curiosity, put your right arm up if you're a technical person, as in you're doing GTM configurations. Keep your hand up, and then put your other arm up if you're also involved in the business side or account management. Okay. And if you also do analytical, I guess stand up as well. Okay, so we have some superheroes here that are literally taking off. Well done. And yeah, those are kind of, if you're in that kind of third category, you are very desirable candidates and good people to know. So that's good that there's some really experienced people here. As I said, I was kind of on the Batman side. The agency was on the Superman side, on the strategy. Now, what are the tips and techniques that I learned from this process that I can share? Obviously, kind of working together is the best way to kind of defeat the beast. And it's not a case of fight against each other. It's collaborating. Even as a consultant, that's one of the keys to kind of winning here. The other aspect was pushing stuff back quickly and then obviously shifting the dependency over onto the client, which was quite easy to do in this one. So that the learnings here is to cooperate. As I said, there were some things that went right and there were some things that went wrong. The things that really helped on the technical side was there was some very robust QA testing plans and methods that I used to greatly reduce the risk of any errors as part of this deployment. Because there were so many moving parts, it was necessary to literally make it bulletproof. And we'll go through some of these examples. The particularly good one is automatic QA testing, which is via Google Sheets, an event ID, and then utilizing Google Analytics API to pull all those bits together to create a kind of feedback loop, so you know when events are working or not working automatically. And there's also some kind of governance aspects as well, as in controlling the workflow. This was actually done before the new Workspaces feature. So the techniques I'm talking about in here actually you can use as an alternative to Workspaces. And it's free. You don't need kind of GA premium or GTM premium. So what tools did I use on the technical side? So the first one was a Google Sheet which pulled out the data from the Google Analytics Classic page view, and it also pulled out the data from the Universal Analytics page view, and then combined the two and then checked for differences between, for instance, sessions, page views, and users for both host name, referrals, and folders, and full pages. So there's a sheet that I did that was running every kind of 2 weeks or sometimes daily. It was a big push that literally told me straight away, is there anything that's bubbling that's creating a strong deviance, i.e. GA Classic says it's 1,000 page views, GA Universal says it's 900 or 800 or 1,200. Like, is it within a plus minus 2% margin of error? So that first one was done automatically via a Google Sheet, and then the second one I've mentioned. This was using event IDs. So each of these 600 events had an ID assigned to it as a hit level custom dimension, with a reference sheet within Google Sheets that was used to automatically count up these numbers. Originally, the first iteration of this, I used event category action label as a unique key, but it didn't work because of language issues and the way that certain tags were formed. So an event ID was the most reliable way of doing automatic QA testing. At some point in the future, there may be a way of making it even better on the next iteration, but I'll show some examples of that in a second. And then I've quite experienced with GTM deployments, so we used a developer guide and the learnings from that. And then when originally we were doing this, I imported some generic GTM configuration files just to speed up the process. So I will go through those now. Oops, if I can go right. One kind of shout out. Carmen, who I don't know if she's here, she did a really cool little automatic kind of health check tool using the Google Analytics API, which connects to an account and then pulls out all of the goal settings and filters and exclude parameters, etc. The only thing this particular one doesn't do custom dimensions, but it's a really good starting point because it's quickly, like straight away, you can see how an account or a profile is set up. The other one that I mentioned, so this one here, this is to check the deviation. So I mentioned it needs to be within a plus minus 2%. So originally I started off with page views, obviously, then I moved to sessions, and then I moved to users. The reason I did page views first was that sessions could be slightly changed by any referrals, as in if it's either an internal referral or a referral from a different source, which is obviously for Universal Analytics, is going to reset the session. So that's why I kind of tackled that one as a second step. So there are other tabs on this sheet that break out referral sessions in more detail. This particular sheet also has a kind of factor of 10 in it. The reason for that was it had the GA Classic data running at 100%, and then the Universal data was running at 10%, and then this sheet was doing a times 10 to get the two both to connect together with each other. So that was a way of getting round kind of sampling, because I was doing a 10x within the Google Sheets. So because I was using a thing called client-side sampling, which is where you only track 10% of people, and then I do a times 10 on this one. I'll explain that in more detail in a second. But as I said, this one hit the kind of green light of page views were plus minus 2%. So great. Next issue. And then this is the QA testing sheet that I mentioned. So you'll see on here, this is the event ID. And then I also had a classification ID for each of these events. So because there are obviously 600, I needed to be able to break them out. So when I added a new event at the bottom, so 601, I wanted that to sort automatically, because Google Tag Manager, when it sorts, it does alphabetically. So I was both adding the event ID and then category ID and then actual ID as a naming convention in GTM, so it sorts nicely, and it also means if I add 601 as an event, it's not going to go straight to the end, it goes through to the next kind of alphabetical event ID integer. And as I mentioned, trying to use a concatenation, if I can say it, of category action label, that was not reliable enough. And in this particular sheet, you'll also notice that I split out dev from live, so I could see the test that I was doing on local environment compared to my live environment. So I could, I wasn't going to pollute the live environment with dev data. Especially when doing kind of QA testing. I don't want to put through like £1 million transaction or something and then skew live. And then the developer guide that I've mentioned, you can download that one. I think there should be a free link on there for the generic developer guide. That's definitely not for newbies, but there's a lot of good material within that that's been built up over the last kind of 2 years. And some example configuration. So in this one, I pulled in a generic config for auto event tracking, which allowed me to kind of at least start from a partially filled sheet, not a blank sheet. And I blended this with the existing setup so that, because I know that the stuff that I'm creating is reliable, the stuff that the client was creating was not quite as reliable. So at least it reduced the chance of error because it's stuff that I control. This is a quick way of standardizing. They didn't have any Drupal, they weren't using Drupal. They did have some sites that were on WordPress, and I had a specific configuration for that. But on this one, that's the generic configuration. And you can see more details of those within that login. Just one other thing, that the client wasn't actually using this particular click tracking tool, but there is a tool called Spandex Metrica, which is free and you can use for click tracking. Has anyone heard of ClickTail? Oh, okay, it's similar to that but free, and it's actually called Yandex Metrica, but I'm trying to get tumbleweed. In terms of separate live and dev environments, so this was, I generally don't use the feature that DTM has for separate environments, where it gives you a kind of authentication key in the actual code. The reason for that is it's a bit rubbish. Instead, I use a server-side switch. So I'm saying and the developers obviously needed to add this within here. So if it's localhost or if it's dev or staging, then default to GTM-dev as a GTM account ID. Change to GTM-dev. So these are known, a list of known dev environments. But if it's not in that list, then always default through to the live environment. So it meant maintaining a list of the developers maintaining that list, but it was a way of reliably testing in a way where we could push stuff through to dev without any risk of it ever getting pushed to live. Sometimes, though, it was not possible to add any server-side code, so an alternative was used, which was a JavaScript switch rather than a client-side switch. Same principle. If it's in a known kind of dev hostname, change it to dev, but always default through to live. And the no script element was also defaulted through to the live environment. Obviously, that's a safe kind of environment for no script. And also, the data was filtered into a dev Google Analytics account via are you running in dev mode? If yes, put it through to say -2. And the same with a nested lookup. So both for this is dev and also hostname lookup as well. So there's a 3 level of nestings to make sure that live is never polluted. And I try, and as a good practice, I try and use -1 for primary and -2 for secondary, or in this one, 61 and 62. It's actually, although it's a small thing, it makes testing faster because you know, -2, it must be the dev environment, or I must be in preview mode, and it's not going into live. The other thing to note on this one is I used a blocking rule that says if you're in dev mode, don't deploy this, but it's a negative of a negative, i.e. it's a positive. If you see here, so it says a blocking rule, don't trigger this if develop mode is false. So in effect, that stops custom HTML from being deployed because it's a negative of a negative, i.e. you'd have to remove that blocking rule for it to be active on live. So that's a safeguard that's also added. Does that make sense? You kind of look a bit confused. Okay. Lunametrics have got an example, like a blog post that explains that method. And then here's a local environment that I used for QA testing. So there's a link up there which runs the version that I'm currently testing, and then a known stable version, and then unit tests for like homepage, 404s, 500, on-click tests, seamless migration tests, videos, e-commerce, etc. One that's particularly good in there was down here. That was a test they were using. They had to test 70 events in one go, and rather than visit 70 pages, that one will fire 70 events using a timer every second. So it goes boom, 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 like kind of, and you'll see that all pull through into real time. It's saved quite a bit of time with QA testing. One other kind of note that we wasn't expecting from this sort of account or migration was that the in-house TMS file was very old. But when we moved from in-house TMS to auto events via GTM, the number of JavaScript errors on the site actually massively decreased. So it was a great win, but it was an unexpected win, which is kind of cool. Again, when we were enabling JavaScript error tracking, it was turned on all of the time, but we only enabled it at a 10% client-side sample. So again, it never risks kind of creating too many hits. Some other kind of notes, there were some process errors that the client encountered when they were sort of pushing to live. This is more of a training issue. The site was broken once, oops. Yeah, that's now, there's more robust methods for checking that. That's more of an issue when you import a container and you don't click create version when you import. So I wish GTM fixed this, but they don't. So you have to always click create version before you kind of sort of publish or preview. In this one, we also had some fail-safe switches. So this one is using GTM whitelisting rather than GTM blacklisting. The reason for that is I had a custom JavaScript variable which was doing a wildcard lookup for a development hostname. So if I turned on GTM blacklisting for custom HTML, it would also block JavaScript kind of macros or variables, which would have prevented the account ID from populating. So in this one, I used GTM whitelisting as a reliable way of creating a safe environment. This was never actually used, thankfully, but the developers were aware of it and knew how to enable it. And the same with a link that disabled GTM via version 1. So it dropped a cookie that turned GTM in effect off within that browser. So I haven't got that long. So I've done the technical stuff. This is now the tactical stuff for sort of account managers and on that side. So this is an obvious one. So breaking out the project in terms of scoping. Unfortunately, there was some new stuff that had to be added to the scope, which was necessary just to create a safe environment. You know, like HTML sandboxes, test profiles. There were some SSL issues that were inherited within the account, and also migrating from custom variables to custom dimensions. Stuff that was not in the original piece of work, but was a necessary sort of change. So that had to be planned out. There's an example kind of Gantt chart which you can use for planning some of these processes. This is a waterfall one, which obviously waterfall is not an ideal process. Really, you want to do a kind of a circular process. But for this particular one, they had a deadline and they had set a number of things that needed to be done. So that's a free link to an example Gantt chart on Google Sheets and an example kind of timeline kind of chart. And an obvious one is we split out the work that required the developer, stuff that we could do ourselves or within GTM, and stuff that required the developers or client to make changes. Obviously, these things here obviously could be done very quickly. These things here took a long period of time to do. Yeah. Oops. And also, just an obvious one, make sure, and this should have been done and should have been enforced, was do an audit of GTM before taking on the project and look for any external TMS files. This one here, the project was an absolute state when it was first taken on. It was a complete mess. One thing I should say is that the client was they were using GTM and a very early adopter, which was great, and the marketing team were very proactive, but they'd inherited a lot of changes over a period of time by multiple users that created a state that was not easy to manage. So I kind of had to make a lot of changes within a short period of time just to kind of clean things up. And then break out the account into live, dev, and split out kind of access levels, etc., just to create sort of sandboxes for users to work within, and then separate out dev and live. So this was pre-workspaces. So here the user would work within their own sandbox, and that would then be checked and then pushed into dev, and then dev would be pushed to live, as in export using a kind of overwrite and flush. So this process did work. It also renaming the account ID, the name of the account, saying PB working on the account was also a good practice. So no one accidentally pushed changes. There are obviously Workspaces kind of gets around this, but this is the pre-Workspaces method. Stuff that wasn't expected within this was the client was using Manatate, which is an A/B testing tool, which has an absolutely rubbish GA integration. And the reason why it's rubbish is that it will search for all Google Analytics account IDs on a page. UA-1, UA-2, whatever, both for GA Classic and Universal, and it will then send in a non-interactive hit. That's okay, but what that ultimately resulted in was doubling of any hits. So when Google Analytics Universal was added as a page view, there weren't just 2 page views, there was now 4, because it was doing GA Classic page view, GA Universal page view, and then 2 new non-interactive events with the kind of event category values being pushed. So it times 2 the number of hits, which then caused them to go over the threshold, which was like, ouch. That is an expensive tool or mistake. So the note I would say if you use this particular tool is you have to rename the GA object to say GA2 so it doesn't push in that extra data. I've kind of got almost a long detailed more information on this, but at some point Manatate may update their tool to fix that. And then the in-house TMS files, these are like, oh my god, they were like literally everywhere. So there were 3 known versions, a second version was detected later, and then a third version and a fourth version. Some of the client didn't even know some of these existed. It was like quite an issue. One of the ways we used to detect them was we migrated to Universal, and then we used the page title as a common key, which exists both within GA Classic and GA Universal. So a flag was added to any tags deployed via GTM, and then an exclude filter was used to see what was left. So anything that was existed within that new kind of within that profile of kind of unknown bucket was then used to work out where these files were. So it meant that you didn't need to use observe point or any other kind of sort of tag crawling system, because we actually had a profile which showed all the stuff that was not deployed via GTM. And so it saved them sort of cost of using a scraping validator or crawler. So as I said, the first kind of phase of this one was hit. We also there were some summary kind of tasks that were built as part of this one, and we've actually got more efficient, tried to reduce the number of meetings with the client in order to hit that, and try and use some processes to get those requests as they're kind of coming in, rather than just ad hoc requests on a phone call, etc. And these same principles were used internally when the client was getting actions to run these reports. It was standardized to try and reduce the time needed. And the same... was over that one. So just kind of some notes on governance. As I said, a kind of check-in, check-out process was used. So via account management method, users were automatically set to read-only or edit access, so that they could or could not make changes. This was the only reliable way of forcing people to kind of check in and out, because if you were set to kind of view-only mode, you couldn't make changes. So that was a way of checking in and checking out and forcing people to do so. So I'd encourage you to try and use this method where you can. Point to note though is that you now have not just view only and edit, you also have approve now as an option. On that note, there's some other safeguards that were built in: two-stage authent, PII protection of IGA filters, JavaScript error tracking, 404s, and inline switches for dev and live, and fail-safe switches for blacklisting or whitelisting. So a pretty robust configuration, but it had to be robust because of the number of problems that were encountered within this setup. So, and I'd also mention that training is one of the issues that has been learnt from this, as in the client kind of had the best intentions in the world, but they didn't know that they could do some of these things better. Thus, that was the learning on their side.